Welcome everybody to the second half of the Art of the Americas slides. And at some point here, well, actually I can tell you the last slide is on the syllabus is from a different file. So I will have to navigate, let's just take a minute or so out of this set of slides that we're going to see for the first 5 slides into a new file I created just about a year ago when I was writing an article for Marin Magazine about the Miwok and Pomo Indians. Some of you know those are the names of the indigenous cultures that occupied for thousands of years what we now call the Bay Area, the North Bay, I should say, Marin and Sonoma counties, where most of you live, right? And where the college is located. So I think that's an important topic. So what will happen is only one of those slides will be a must-know, but we'll see maybe, several more views of the reconstructed Miwok village that you can go to as an extra credit option. That'll be at the end of the lecture. We still probably will end a few minutes earlier than usual. It depends on how many questions you have. Okay, but before we get, yes. Thank you for being so, you're obviously very much, okay to do that. And it is true for everybody. Important life events, whatever they may be, or family business is something that legitimately can call for someone to either sign in late or leave early. I appreciate the notice. Only if you're not going to attend at all, or you're going to be out of town for a week or something, you should contact me, but that's not exactly a requirement. What is a requirement, and I'll go ahead and say this, is if you aren't able to do one of the assignments by the due date, and you have written evidence, has now already come up with several students, and they all had them written evidence that you can send me as a screenshot of a doctor's note or something, proof of medical emergency or medical issue that prevented you from attending that day's lecture, or turning in that assignment that week. You get a week's extension. Oh, the other category is family emergencies, like if you're out of town or someone in your, happens to all of us at some point, and someone in your family is not well, or you need to take care of them, then I just have to have something in writing that indicates that. And I usually accept, your brief summation of what that family crisis or family need was, and then you get another week's. That also allows you, a week's extension. Speaking of that, though, I do this once, maybe twice, actually twice a semester. I didn't used to, but on Zoom classes, it's particularly appropriate because I don't get to see you one-to-one in person at any point. Unless you show up, you could. It's where we are right now, is in Hanley Hall, in the adjunct office at the end of the main hallway, the north end, where I could meet students, but I end up meeting only the ones from my in-person class. So here's what I'm going to do. This is meant to just give you, those of you who fall into this category, there are only 4 at the moment, of students who actually did turn in or do their midterms, and yet I have not received a paper from, for whatever reason. And of course, it's not a terribly bad scenario. If you didn't do it yet, you just want to take more time, or you're just overwhelmed by other things, you don't get more points off after the first week of being late. My policy, I've said it many times, but just in case you still aren't quite clear, it's only 10 points off after 7 days or more of being late, unless you had an extension. I just described what that qualifies as. So these are people who tells me obviously they're in the class, they took the midterm, and somehow me their papers. Okay, and then that way I hope it's a little bit of an incentive for you to try and get them in, hopefully in the next several days, maybe by this weekend, so then get great and get back to you, and you know where you stand. We're halfway through the semester. Literally half the assignments have been given, and so if you've only done one of the two, either just anybody who didn't take the midterm, I should have heard from you by now. I did, from a couple people who had evidence that they had sent it, somehow went to the wrong email. I would accept that if there's not written, email trail, right? That's the word, email trail evidence that you did submit it on time. But I don't think that applies to any of these people. I'm talking about people who did take the midterm. Here we go. There are 4, and who I have not received a paper from. Okay, Maria Berti. Okay, Aaron Oakes, Gabby Mays, and Tamara Taubold. So hopefully, if you're one of those people who I mentioned, if you haven't yet had time to finish a paper, or you're still working on it, you'll try to get it done and into me, hopefully before the next class. That way I can start getting those late paper grades back. It takes me up to a week, depending on how many I get. I'm still getting, papers from my in-person class that also some of those students hadn't turned in yet. Let's see, we have everybody here? Yeah, right.
Hey,
Okay.
Mark,
Yes, quick questions?
this is Maria Iberti.
Mhm.
So after it was discovered that my paper hadn't come in, remember, I sent you an email saying, well, I had
Oh.
sent you my first draft. And then I immediately
Yeah.
sent you the paper
You're right.
again.
You're right. And the reason is because that paper is sitting in a pile of others. So you know what? That's why I do this. So
Oh, good.
I stand corrected. You did send it to me, and obviously there is a email trail about when you send it in, so that isn't going to be an
Right.
issue. However, it somehow did go astray. I just want you to know I didn't just ignore it or overlook it or forget about it or space it out. I don't know why. It doesn't matter. You had proof that you had, after you followed up for the last. So that leaves only the other three names that I mentioned.
Okay,
Okay.
so you do have it, so I don't need to send it again, or?
Yeah, you don't need to send it again.
Oh, excellent. All
If
right.
you want to, for your peace of mind, you can send me one short sentence line email or even, 5 or 6 words. Please reconfirm or double confirm that the paper.
Okay.
But
I
you don't
will
have to
do-
resend the paper itself. I do know that you were right. It did show up after you
Oh,
sent it
excellent.
the second time.
Thank you.
It happens. Yeah. I mean, obviously things aren't perfect. That's why I like teaching in-person classes. I hope I'll see some of you in the spring when I'll be teaching 3. That is, knock on wood. There's no wood here, there. Plywood up above the shelves in this office, or semi-wood. Anyway, the point is that with enrollment numbers dropping all over the state, you've heard this, right? It's big news all over the educational community. It's all over. The San Francisco Chronicle has been writing articles about it. I subscribe, yes, to a written, printed newspaper I read every morning, especially when it has to do with my profession and our classes, about teaching and enrollments and budgets and drops and the state universities are now surprisingly actually having more openings. So if you want to transfer, for your second half, your BA, right, to a state university, now's a good time to apply. The deadline is November 30th, by the way. So you have plenty of time. And I'll write a letter of recommendation to anyone who's earning an A or a B in my classes. I obviously have to have some cut off there. But of course, it's a little early for many of you to think about that. But if somehow that comes up before the end of November, you don't ask me to turn around in 48 hours and do a whole file and fill in all these online forms and all. You got to give your teachers at least a week or even better 2 before the deadline to submit recommendations, which always include a letter. I'm happy to write if someone has earned an A, especially in my classes.
This is Aaron. I sent you my research paper 4 days ago, and you sent me an email saying you got it.
Okay, there again, if it was one of those that I hadn't received the first, it's because I made notes a week ago to do this, and I meant to go over it, and we had been done with this and out of the way with it. So would you do the same? Yes, that's almost certainly true. I don't have those files on my laptop. That's the other thing. I was double checking and I realized, well, I have to at least, even if it's overkill, it's better I do that than just not say anything and a few people forget about the papers and then they're all backed up. Yes, I think 99% certain your paper's in my files at home in my mainframe, whatever you guys call the main computer that's twice as big as a laptop and much more storage capacity. So please, if you want to, just do the same thing like I mentioned to Maria. Just for your peace of mind, don't have to resend it. And you'll get a response from me by tomorrow, midday tomorrow, because I don't get home until after 11 o'clock at night. I'm teaching here 2 classes every Wednesday, and I don't get home until very late, and I'm not in the energy zone where I can check all my emails at 11:30 at night. So I will check them again tomorrow about noon or early afternoon. So if you want that reassurance, but yes, I do remember, as I recall that. So then that would leave it with only 2 out of the 4 that I mentioned who might still need to do a paper and submit it as soon as you get a chance. Okay, let's move on to today's topic. Let's see, I think we still have, oh my goodness, yes, good timing here. All right. So we haven't got to the first slide yet, but I'm going to give you a definition that I kind of overlooked. I mean, I wasn't going to forget it, but I want to give it to you now. It's one that's on the list of terms to know. It was the only one new definition for this week. We already covered the culture it comes from but this definition is an important one and it could appear on the final, which is exactly the same format as the midterm, and it covers only everything that we studied after the midterm, right? It's not cumulative to the final. Okay, here we go. If you should have your list of terms in front of you, every class, every Zoom class, Mayan bloodletting ritual. It's a long definition, but it's not complicated. It's pretty straightforward. Once you hear the definition, you should already know about it because you should have read about it in Stockstead. Okay, here we go. Mayan bloodletting ritual. A Mayan religious ceremony in which Mayan high priests, you could just say a religious ceremony in which, is obviously redundant, a religious ceremony in which Mayan high priests, plural, because now one person wouldn't work. You'll see why to do this. Okay, in which Mayan high priests, not the lower rank, but the top level, right? High priests pricked themselves with a large thorn on their fingers or the insides of their mouths, comma, sorry, it's a long definition, in which Mayan high priests pricked themselves with a large thorn on their fingers or the inside of their mouths, comma, and let the blood, their blood, drip into a large stone cup, and let their blood drip into a large stone cup, comma, one last line, which was then poured down the stairs of a pyramid to soak into the ground below. I'll say it again, which was then poured over the side, you could just say side, you don't have to say steps, of a pyramid to soak into the ground below in order to guarantee a good crop for that season. They believed the gods demanded blood. And if they couldn't get blood from their prisoners they captured in war, then the priests themselves had to provide it. I'll say the whole thing again one more time. It's a religious ritual, a Mayan bloodletting ritual, right? A religious ritual in which Mayan high priests pricked themselves with a thorn on their fingers or the insides of their mouths, comma, then let the blood drip into a large stone cup, which was then poured over the side of a pyramid into the ground below in order to guarantee a good harvest that year. Of course, obviously, they did this every year, several times a year, usually. Okay, so it was self, inflicted wounds, but of course, minor ones. But if you got, a dozen or more priests doing this for a couple of hours, you're going to get a pretty good amount of blood. And that's what they were doing, producing enough blood to pour it into the ground. But of course, they were on top of the pyramid. Remember, we covered that. So in fact, let us just do a quick, sorry, let's do it there. Sorry, good time. We just get to the first slide here, but I do want to go back for just a moment before we do the must know, and let's get this away. And now let's get this enlarged so I can go back and show you what I'm talking about. There, the priest, the Mayan high priest, would stand on top of this platform and produce their own blood from that ritual. I just described it, so I shouldn't need to repeat that definition, of course. So remember, I might ask you a question on the true false section of the final about this religious ceremony. And then the blood would be, see it here from, but this is probably from victims whose hearts were being cut out. But that wasn't as often as the voluntary bloodletting by the actual Mayan high priest. And if you get dozens of them, because you could see they could fit easily a couple of dozen inside each of these temples, and they all stood together and did that, within a couple of hours, you're going to have a pretty good amount of blood, And when we're saying stone cup, I'm not talking about a drinking cup. We're talking about a bucket, basically. But everyone thinks bucket is plastic, so that's why I said a large stone cup. You can see them. Any museum. I know a couple of you talked to. I know Tanya, you and I. That museum in Mexico City, the National Anthropological Museum, is a fascinating place. They have several examples of those same stone cups, which have been found by archaeologists, and which once would have been filled up to the top with blood so that it was enough to actually go down into the ground below. And even if it just evaporated, the point is the gods saw that they were getting their ritual sacrifice to the gods, and then they'd grant a good harvest that year. Okay, so we already covered the meaning of this slide though, and it's, of course, if you weren't here for that lecture, you will want to watch it when I post them on YouTube by 8 p.m. Friday. So let's get to the next must know. Here we go from the syllabus. Okay, and this is a very one-word title, but rarely that short. A llama, just the name of the animal. Llama, of course, is with two L's. L-A-M-A. The location was the country Bolivia. So now we already moved to South America, or we have been in Central or South America for the first several slides on Monday. And again, for this next one, and then after that, for the rest of today, we're going to look at North American indigenous art from the last several centuries. But this is, of course, Bolivia. I think everybody knows, right? It's a country in South America. If you didn't already know that, you should write that. And this was part of the llama. Part of the llama, how, right? Part of the Inca, I-N-C-A. We covered who they are from the last slide we saw. The Incas were, here we go. We're just starting with the first must know here. The Incas had the largest empire of all of the indigenous empires before the arrival of the Spanish. It ran the length of, if you didn't already know this or you weren't here on Monday, you should be writing this. When I say what does that mean, it was a very large empire. It stretched almost the entire length of South America. Look at a map. It's a long, long continent, thousands of miles. From, obviously Bolivia, I think most people know is in the northern half of South America, but their empire stretched even further north. So just say from the northern part or sections of South America almost to the southern tip was the Inca Empire along the western edge of South America, thousands of miles long, very large empire. One of the main things that they were famous for is their metal sculpture, especially gold and silver. I like this one for two reasons more than the gold sculpture I've seen of theirs in museums and many websites. This is a roughly about a 6-inch tall, 4-inch long portrait of a llama, one of their sacred animals. And you probably know this, but if you didn't, you should write this. The llama was not only a sacred animal to them in terms of their religious beliefs, it was essential for their survival. They're in the mountains. The tallest mountain chains on average in the entire Western Hemisphere are the Andes. Of course, you've all heard that name, but if you weren't sure what that means, it's the mountain chain that runs along the western edge of South America. And those are the tallest on average, the tallest mountains in this hemisphere. And the Inca Empire was a mountain-based empire. They also ruled the flatlands, of course, below the mountains. But their capital cities, including Machu Picchu, which we covered, I'm not going to go back to it, this slide here. That's a very important slide. That's not going to be cut from the study list for sure. Their capitals, regional and national, well, they didn't call them nations. And so you can say imperial capitals or main capital cities, and their local or regional capitals were up in the mountains, partly for health reasons, because it was a healthier climate than down in the lowlands where there were all kinds of plagues and diseases and things from the hot, humid environment. So in the mountain areas of the Incan Empire, llamas were essential for, you can guess, but if it's not obvious, write this now. What were they used for? Transportation, right? And also providing, local beast of burden, meaning they could pull certain, not very heavy objects, but things, that most human beings wouldn't have been able to pull. So they were used for labor, sometimes for construction of like a wooden or thatched roof house for a family, but more often for transporting things up and down the mountains. And they were, of course, indigenous or native, these animals, to the South American mountains. And so they were seen as sacred animals, that there was, even some degree of some kind of worship, but not like, they weren't like the Egyptian gods. Sometimes they actually made animal gods. They didn't go that far, but they just believed these were sacred animals. So they didn't abuse them or harm them. They treated them well. Sometimes even, from what I've read, almost like a member of the family, like many people would to say a pet dog or something. But these were also functioning, essential members of any of the Inca families that owned one. And of course, the larger, more powerful Incan clans, groups of families would own herds. I think the right word is herds, groups of many, many llamas that they would, of course, own and take care of, and use, maybe even rent out or something, or loan them out for other families that didn't have one or didn't have enough for, again, transporting goods or some kind of labor tasks. So this one is silver. And silver is, of course, the second most valuable precious metal, obviously after gold. They were known, the Incas, as master sculptors in metal. So metal sculptors, right? That's sculptors, or you can say it this way, they created some of the most skilled or detailed metal sculptures of any of the indigenous cultures of the Western Hemisphere. They were very skilled. Look at the face here. Let's do a close-up. I think you can see there's a personality here. Now, some of you may have been, I think it was not since the pandemic, right? But there's the Harvest Festival, right? It's in October at the Santa Rosa Fairgrounds. I think someone must have been there. I know I just take my daughter. She loved it because she loved seeing all the animals. There were llama races there. I'm pretty sure I have that right. Maybe my memory's faulty, but I'm pretty sure there were races of llamas that were, of course, living on farms here in Sonoma County, right? And so some of you have seen llamas up close. They're pretty big animals, maybe taller than a human being. But this is a miniature, of course, figurine or a small figure of a llama, which looks like it's suddenly gotten, the attention of this llama has been, its ears are pricked up and its head is raised, so it looks like it's paying attention to some human being that's communicating or talking to it, whatever. You can see it's paying attention to something, and it's probably a human, someone who owns this llama and maybe many others. Now, this blanket is a very accurate reproduction of what the Incas would have done, partly to keep the llamas warm, because it gets pretty cold in the mountains, especially at night, but also, to protect the back or skin of the llama's back if they put heavy objects for the llama transport. But that's new. The figurine, that's the right word, you can just say figure, but a small figure is called a figurine, is original, intact, over 500 years old. So again, as I said, the date of this one is circa, well, I didn't actually say, and I apologize, 1400s. That would be the century before the Spanish conquest. So at the high point of or golden age, you could say it that way, of the Inca Empire, they created some of the most beautiful metal sculptures, often of animals, as well as some of their gods, and of course, people. But they were especially fond of llamas. And it shows, there's an affection, I think you can see an affection here that the artist has for this animal, maybe one of his own animals or hers. It could be a man or a woman who created this sculpture. And so let's do now the formal elements. First of all, for size, it's a real three-dimensional object, roughly 6 inches, might be a little more, maybe 7. So about 6 or a little over 6 inches tall, and about 4 or a little more than 4 inches across. And it is a single mass. You couldn't really, unless you want to break it down and say the blanket, which of course they originally probably did make a small or miniature blanket and attach it to the back of the metal figure. Then if you want to break it down that way, obviously there are 2 masses. The llama is obviously the largest, and then the blanket. For space, I'm sorry, there's no technique for space here. I already mentioned it's the real three-dimensional object. There is no modeling. This is in a museum, so just the shadows created by the museum lights cause the modeling. Here there is carved line. It's all over the face. It's I'd even say in the ears, certainly the eyes, the nose, the mouth. Very nicely done, and on the hoofs here. So there's a carved line to create simulated texture, but it also has the real smooth texture of silver. The colors are, of course, cool, obviously, on the silver and warm on the blanket. The rhythm is obvious, the 4 legs, the 2 ears, 2 eyes, plenty of rhythm, and it is almost entirely stable. Look at it. It's standing almost bolt upright, pretty much very close to a perfect straight line from the hoofs all the way to the top of the ears. And of course, the body right? Torso, I guess you'd say, or the middle of this figure is at a right angle to the front. And so those are all pretty much stay. The only thing really dynamic here is the tail. And maybe you could say that tops of the ears and the bridge of the nose, but those are minor details. It's almost entirely stable. It's balanced, completely symmetrical, left to right. It depends on where you draw the line, but if you draw the line, here we go. Good timing. We're still on the first must-know slide, the llama from Bolivia. So I'm just finishing up with the formal elements here. Okay, so this would be, if I were to draw a line this way, I would think of it as roughly equal, because the neck and head are thicker and wider than the legs. You decide. If you think of it as more unbalanced toward the bottom because there are 4 legs and only 1 neck and head, I wouldn't argue with that, but to me, it looks roughly balanced. However, it clearly is unbalanced toward the right, obviously, with this whole front part of the body. Proportions are accurate here. Proportion, there's no scale, remember. A scale requires 2 or more figures of human or animal figures side by side in a work of art, like a painting or sculpture or drawing. This is one object, one animal. So there's no issue with scale, no distortion therefore, but the proportions of this llama are pretty accurate. You might say that the hoofs look a little bit small, or the upper legs. I think, if I recall the ones I saw at the Harvest Festival in the fairgrounds of Santa Rosa, the legs weren't quite that thick at the top, but that's pretty minor. And I'm not enough of an expert on the anatomy of llamas. I can't remember that much about years ago, the last time I saw a llama in real life. If you know for a fact that that's true, that the legs are shown too thick at the top, then you would say, if it's on the test, that it has some altered or distorted proportion on the upper legs, which are too large or too wide for the rest of the body, if you know that to be true. Okay, balance, rhythm, and I think we've covered everything. Line, texture. Okay. Now we're doing North American native cultures. Indigenous, of course, you just had an Indigenous Peoples Day celebration on Monday here on the main campus. I only teach the online classes in my house at Berkeley on those days, so I didn't attend. I would have if I was up here. I just quick side, anybody attend that event? I think it was on the front part of the campus, if I recall, but in front of the library and that area. Anyway, every year, for many years now, the college has had a celebration of Indigenous cultures in October, of course, on Indigenous Peoples Day. So here we go. The next must know, or second for today, is 2 words: bandolier bag. Bandolier bag. And that's BANDOLIER, and of course, bag with 1 G. Kansas, 1860, Kansas, which is where the state of Kansas is now. So this is an object that a warrior from one of the Plains Indian tribes would have worn into battle. And that is what the word bandolier means. It's something that would have been, of course, an object that a warrior would wear to contain the ammunition they used for their rifles. By 1860, there were, of course, many tribes that had been resisting the incursion by European settlers, and their warriors knew very well how to use European weapons. I think everybody knows horses are not indigenous to this hemisphere. They were imported here by the Spanish, but by this time, hundreds of years after the Spanish first arrived on the shores of Mexico, and the horses began to multiply, they were superb cavalry men. The warriors were all men, at least in the Plains tribes they were. So this would have been a warrior, a male, who would have been very skilled at riding a horse and shooting a rifle to defend against the enemy. Now, it wasn't only the European colonists, it was also, or pioneers. It also could have been enemy tribes that they would have had conflicts with, of course. These were the Plains Indians, were some of the greatest warriors of this continent, of North America, in their heyday. 1860, they still controlled most of the Central Plains. Within 20 or 30 years, that wasn't true. But by 1860, there was still an independent areas under the control of Plains Indian tribes. So this is one of those tribes that would be where Kansas, the state now of Kansas, is dead center of what's now the United States, of course, is where this tribe was headquartered. What's important, though, besides how it was used and what a bandolier bag was meant for, what the warrior would do with it, it's also meant to be a symbol of the status of this warrior, because this would have been made for him by someone else in the tribe, possibly his wife or some other skilled craftsperson, man or woman, to show off the fact that besides the beauty of it, I mean, I think it's a beautiful object if you look at it. You've got floral motifs here. These almost look like tulips, or maybe they're poppies. I mean, yeah, I'm not even sure. Kansas is only a state I've ever driven through or flown over, so I can't say. I don't know what the flower species are, but whatever kind of native species, wildflowers, no, you can just say whatever local wildflowers were, this is symbolic of the blossoms of wildflowers in that part, the plains, right, of what's now Kansas. And over here, you've got an interesting geometric motif. To us, it looks like an X. I've had some students say, doesn't that look like a cowboy boot? I don't think that's what they were thinking. It's more likely just a geometric shape, which happens to correspond to an X in, of course, the English alphabet. But it's a beautiful pattern, and it creates the real, we'll do the formal analysis in a few minutes. And then the object is made, of course, entirely by hand, and it took a long time to stitch. They didn't have sewing machines, right? They existed back east, of course, in the big cities, but not the plains. So this is all hand stitched, and it's fabric and beads, right? And then, of course, these tassels. So you have tassels, fabrics, and beads are the three materials, which they would have used on almost any kind of fancy, attire for a warrior or a chief, right? To dress with during either ceremonies, because the warriors, of course, didn't only go out riding with their rifles to look for enemies. They most of the time all they did was have protecting events, ceremonies, religious ceremonies, and of course, if they wore these, it could be just for a religious ceremony, not only for battle, but both. Primarily, though, this was intended for use in a battle. It's roughly the height of about 2/3, I'm sorry, I meant to say 2/3 the height of one of their warriors. The Plains Indians tend to be fairly tall. Not all indigenous tribes were like the Aztecs were not very tall warriors, very fierce warriors, but they were on average several inches shorter than the Spanish invaders. So here we would have had a man who was probably about 6 feet wearing this. And so it comes down to about 4 or 4.5 feet. So it would be down below their waist, the actual bag where the ammunition was kept, and that would be in this pouch. So it's become a pouch. You could say bag or pouch. I actually think pouch is a better word. Where the ammunition was kept was down here. And if it's not obvious, that's where the opening is. And you can see the beads here. Beads, right? Of course, the cloth itself, the background of this whole thing is called all these patterns, and then the stitching that's done with threads, of course. So threads, beads, and fabric. I think it's cotton, but you can just say fabric. Okay, those are the real materials that they would often use for this kind of decorative item and functional item. All right, that's pretty much the whole meaning. Let's do a formal analysis. Balanced, yes, totally symmetrical if you look carefully. Although some people think the X is looking larger. Yeah, there's more of the plant, right, blossoms or flowers, I should say flowering blossoms, but they're the same exact width and length, both sides, so it is balanced. To me, it's unbalanced pretty clearly to the bottom, but some people think because the neck pieces go around the neck, so this is worn, of course, around the back of the neck, down the front of the chest or abdomen, and then this bag would be down between their waist and their knees. And it could be shifted to the side if they were riding a horse and chose to do that. But in any case, usually when they were walking, it was in front of the bag, the pouch. I'd say it's clearly unbalanced toward the bottom because this pouch or bag is so much larger than the top section of the neck. So unbalanced toward the bottom, completely symmetrical, left to right. The colors, beautiful colors, aren't they here? The blues, of course, are the cool colors and the white stitching, but most of the colors are warm, reds, yellows, browns, pinks, of course. And then the texture is the real textures. No, I don't think you could say simulated texture. It doesn't look like it to me. The real textures of, again, the beads, the threads, the fabric, right? And the tassels. Those are all real textures. And I think you could say that the beads are smooth and the other textures, the fabric and the tassels and the stitching are rough, real textures. But I don't see simulated textures here. And of course, we already mentioned the rhythm, the repeated shapes of the flower blossoms and the geometric pattern, which appears to be an X, but I think it's just a coincidence. And then there's, of course, rhythm on the tassels and the other pattern flowers. I like these a lot. These almost look like abstract painting by, let's see, Matisse. Matisse, we're going to study Matisse. I think you'll see what I mean when we get to the 20th century painters. Very similar, but this is 50 years before they were doing their expressionist paintings of the early 1900s in Europe. Very interesting. And yet you can recognize that these are leaf patterns here on plants. Beautifully done. I think the whole thing's dynamic. You could say technically the top edges of the pouch itself and the actual backing of it, those I guess are stable, but yeah, that's not the majority. What you see is either diagonal or curved lines everywhere. It's mostly dynamic. The largest mass would be the, I guess you could call it, if you see neck piece, that sounds like it's only around their neck. The sides, we'll just say the side banners or segments, it's really one piece. So that clearly is a single mass, if you look at it that way. And then the bag, that's just two masses here. For space, I mentioned it's a real space. I would say you could say the plant motifs, both on the side strips, I guess you call them, right? Or down below on the bag, that of course, it creates overlapping of the background, but the actual space is mostly the real dimensions. Again, it's about a 4.5 or 5, yeah, it's more like 4 to 4.5, not 5 feet long from the tip of the neck piece, right, to the bottom of the bandolier bag is roughly 4 or 4.5 feet. And that's all real space. There's no modeling here. None. In proportion, I don't think there's any issue with scale or distorted or abnormal scale proportions here. Okay, let's see. Oh, line. Here the line's visual, but it's stitched. That's what creates the outlines of the flower blossoms and these wonderful geometric patterns on each side. Okay, this is fascinating, and I'll go ahead and tell you that if I had more time, I'd show you my own slides of the best museum I have seen in this country, but I haven't been to many of them, for indigenous North American art. You're not going, well, some of you may know if you've been to Chicago, it's the Art Institute of Chicago. They have a whole new wing they opened up with a large section of galleries on indigenous art from North and South America, and beautifully presented. They had a grant from some, I don't know where, but anyway, it's one of the most famous museums of art in the world. It's where my parents met as students on a scholarship, each one of them, a long time ago, and where Frank Lloyd Wright used to go and give lectures and things. But that museum, the Museum of the Art Institute of Chicago, you could check online if for extra credit, you might want to do this. It's a wonderful collection, and most of it's been digitalized. But this is not at that museum. This is a museum in a different state, this piece. So what is it? Our next piece here is Hyde Painting Battle Scene. 4 words again. Hyde, of course, H-I-D-E, Painting Battle Scene. North Dakota, 1800. We actually have the year, and that's unusual, the exact year. This depicts an actual battle that the Dakota Indians, even if you didn't know this, as part of the meaning, the 2 states, North and South Dakota, were named after that indigenous tribe, right? The Dakota Indians, they're very fierce warriors. They won a major victory over their enemies in a big battle just before this. And you don't have to say much, a couple of years, let's say, before this was created. So this commemorates their victory, the Dakota tribe's victory over their enemies, another Plains Indian tribe, which are depicted here as their warriors on the horses, and the defeated or dead and dying warriors are the enemies, the defeated warriors of the Dakotas. I don't remember which tribe it is they defeated, but you do want to mention that the culture that created this and the scene is depicting is of the Dakota warriors from the Dakota tribe who had just recently, just say in the previous a few years, had won a major victory against their enemies, other Plains Indians, in what's now, of course, North Dakota. If it's not obvious, I think you should all have read this, the tanned hide of a buffalo. It's a buffalo hide, which they used as a canvas. It's brilliant. There's a couple of these kinds of paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago, and there are other museums with them in them. I don't think any in the Bay Area, though. I've never seen one of these pieces. It's a traditional art form or medium. The right word is medium, right? Type of art, visual art. It painting on an animal hide. It didn't always have to be buffaloes, but if you had a large animal like a buffalo, you could paint a very large scene. Look at this group scene with dozens of warriors scattered across a battlefield. It's fascinating. By the way, there is one like this. You'll have to write this, but it might be another extra credit option to find an article and forward it to me, a link to it, about the Battle of Little Bighorn. Everybody knows what happened. Custer got his comeuppance there, got what he deserved. And that victory was also done up as a painting after the Sitting Bull, right, the commander of the indigenous tribes, the Plains Indians that defeated Custer. That was many years later, but that's a fascinating piece. I've only seen it in photos and online images. I don't know. It's probably at the Smithsonian, I'll bet, in Washington. Anyway, so there's a tradition. The point is that for generations, but why you can even say centuries, because it goes back before the first contact with whites, explorers even. So hundreds of years, 400s of years, Indians in the plains culture, the Plains Indians of the central North American plains, of course, all the way up into Canada. It's not just what's the US, but all the way up into northern Canada, would create scenes recording important events in their history by painting on the back of a tanned hide of a deceased animal, and the largest canvas they could create for that would be a buffalo hide. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meaning here, except you notice what they did here with the legs. I think that's fascinating. They went all the way out to where the hoof would be, right? Just missing the hoof. And then the head, where the mouth would be, right? And the eyes. Yeah, so this took a lot of work. First to create to get the hide itself off the animal took skill, then another type of skilled labor. I'm sure it was more than one person that did each of these tasks. And that'll be the last thing about the meaning here on this one, is then to tan it so that it's preserved. I mean, it's 200 plus years old and it's in very good condition. It wouldn't be if they hadn't treated it or tanned it properly. And then, of course, the last step is to have artists from that tribe do the paintings of the figures. Okay, let's do a formal analysis here. This is a warm composition. I don't see, well, you could say this almost looks black, but look carefully, it's really a vegetable dye. And that's how they created these figures. And have paints, of course. I mean, later on, some native tribes, I think the one that depicts the defeat of Custer at Little Bighorn was done with actual paints, because by the 1870s, the Indians would have had the access to paints, but not in 1800s. So this is all vegetable dyes, which are by definition not going to be black. That's dark brown. So I would say everything, including the darkest spots on these human figures, is all warm colors. Obviously, the horses are done with different warm colors: brown, yellow, orange, tan. And the actual canvas itself, or animal hide, the buffalo hide, is, of course, by definition, a light kind of tan color. So it's all warm. Here, the lines are both bold on the horses, particularly, and some of the warriors, and thin on some, especially the dead, defeated enemy. Whoops, I meant to just bring us over there. You do see thin and bold lines alternating here. There, I don't see any modeling. Not really, because the horses are solid, well, almost, single, tones of whatever color they're painted. And some of them don't have any paint or not paint, any dye, sorry, animal dye, any color on them. These here, of course, are just plain. So I don't see any kind of modeling. And really, there isn't much simulated texture. They weren't, trying to create that. Some Indian hide paintings I've seen did have simulated texture, but not this one. Rhythm, obvious. The horses, the warriors, the bows, and arrows, even some shields are showing repeated shapes. And this is totally dynamic. I mean, you could say some of the horses look like they're standing almost totally upright, but they're in motion. their legs, even if this one is the closest thing to being totally stable, but even it's pitching forward because why? A warrior's riding it into battle. So even the horses that are not totally dynamic have a dynamic quality to the leaning pose of each horse. There's none of them just standing bolt upright, and all the human figures are dynamic. Their arms outstretched in battle. So it's, and of course, so is the hide itself. Obviously, the entire outer edges of it, there's no straight lines around this buffalo hide. For space, you do have overlapping of some warriors on the back of the horses, though you don't see a lot of it here. You see, they didn't choose to put the legs of, but here they did. So some places there is overlapping of warriors over the horses, but mostly all it is just the figures on their own. And some of those figures, like this one here, you see their arm overlaps there. This one's dead or dying, right? Bleeding to death or already dead. One of the defeated enemy warriors. So there's some limited amounts of overlapping on a few figures, but mostly they're just independent objects. I don't see a larger or smaller mass, except the horses are slightly larger than the warriors. Okay, so if you break it down that way, the largest masses would be the horses. And then the warriors, although some of the warriors are so big that like these two here, that they're even bigger than the horses. So it's hard to say there's a consistent larger or smaller mass. But if you break it down this way, you could say the animal hide itself, the buffalo hide, is the largest mass, and then mostly the horses and then the warriors. Okay, and balance roughly, I would say, in the arrangement of figures, roughly equal numbers, not exact, but pretty close, above and below. That is the spine. And those are beads meant to demarcate the middle of this animal hide. So above and below the midline is pretty roughly equal. Of course, the actual animal hide is obviously, the animal it was when it was alive is symmetrical. I would say balanced, certainly top to bottom, but you could make the case this looks more slightly unbalanced toward the right because of the length of the hind legs. For whatever reason, I don't think the buffalo's back legs were longer than their front, or the thing would have a hard time running, right? So it's just the way this was created. It gives the impression of being slightly unbalanced toward the right. And then there's, you know, like I said, with proportion here, you could say, yeah, okay, here I would say that the warriors, some of the warriors are deliberately exaggerated or distorted, you know, altered or distorted, the right two words, in terms of their scale. I spoke the scale of the warriors, each figure to another, that is what constitutes scale of some of the warriors, especially the ones on the far upper left corner, are too large compared to the horses and the other warriors. They're exaggerated, they're larger for whatever reason. We don't know why that was done. So there is some distortion or alteration of scale here, but not proportion within the bodies of each figure. Okay, I think we covered everything. Let me just make sure. Color, yeah, we did, right? Texture, modeling, yeah, okay. All right, this one's fascinating. Grizzly Bear House Screen is the title. Grizzly, of course, has two Z's. Grizzly Bear House Screen, 4 words. The location is Canada, the country of Canada today. Circa 1840s, you can ignore the little c, remember, on any date that might come from the syllabus and might appear, the slide, I mean, that might appear of that item. You can ignore the little c, so just you can say 1840s. Okay, so this is from a culture that was in what we would today call the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. Now that's with the capital P, not the word specific, obviously. Many of you have been. It's a beautiful part of the continent. Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, those areas. But of course, being in Canada, it was probably British Columbia, almost certainly British Columbia, what today is the province, the Canadian province of British Columbia. Okay, and I've seen things like this in their museums. They have wonderful museums of Indigenous art, both in Victoria, the capital of British Columbia, and their one big city, Vancouver. They're both fantastic cities if you haven't been to those places. Museums are wonderful. And they have whole separate museums dedicated only to Indigenous art, totem poles and carved figures and things like this. So what is this? It's the entrance to a house of a culture that the broad term for is potlatch, one word, just like it sounds, potlatch, right? P-O-T-L-A, right? TCH, I guess you could say. Well, the point is, it's about how you spell that word. It's not, remember, you have no points off for spelling if it isn't exactly right. On any word that's not from the syllabus, those you do have to spell correct. So potlatch, one word culture, would imply the very prosperous indigenous tribes that lived in the Pacific Northwest who had an abundance of goods, more than they needed. That's unusual. Most of the indigenous cultures were, subsistence. They had just enough. If they kept hunting or farming, or maybe some of both, each year they could feed their own people and rarely starved. But this culture, the potlatch, they were the per capita, on average, you would say, or per capita, per person, they were the wealthiest of all the North American, you got to say North American indigenous cultures, potlatch. Why? Because they had a very fertile environment. The Northwest is very fertile. Of course, there's a rainforest, if you didn't know this, up there on the peninsula across the channel from Seattle. I would recommend going there if you're interested. Unique environments in this country. I mean, there is no other rainforest in North America. I mean, in the United States. Well, yeah, I think that's right. North America, all of it. It's called the Olympic rainforest. So they came from a culture, from a region, region that was very, very well off, you could say that, in terms of natural resources. So what did they do with that? Did they try to collect more, become, an early version of wealthy or billionaire type, people competing for? No, they shared the wealth equally among their own people, and they had, this is an important detail, this is unique to any North American, or as far as I know, Western Hemisphere cultures of indigenous, from North America all the way to the tip of South America. This is the only culture I think you could say this, the potlatch Northwest, Pacific Northwest tribes. They would give away their excesses of goods to prove their, worth as people, not financial or physical value, but generosity. The more generous they were with their neighboring villagers or other members of that tribe that they lived with, or even, different areas of, other actual, let's see, free up storage space. Okay, I can see I'm going to have to, we'll get through this, but I'm going to have to delete some old lectures, but that's after we're done. So let's just say that this was a very, very generosity, you could say, or generous culture, and that they considered generosity a very important value that they exercise by sharing not only within their own villages their abundance of goods, but between different areas or regions of that culture. One tribe to another would give away goods, and they competed that way to see who gave away the most goods that beyond the ones that they needed. Pretty unique. The last thing to say is this, in interest of one of their wooden houses or meeting places. Well, it would have been a tribal home. I meant a clan, a single clan's home. Extended families, of course, that's the norm around the world, except in some Western cultures, of course, like most in America, it isn't anymore, it used to be. So these would be generations of the same family living in a large wooden house, and you entered through, yes, the vagina. That's what this symbolizes. It's a female grizzly bear, which is guarding the entrance to this family compound. Well, I would say lodge. A better word is lodge. Yeah, you don't want to say hut. It's not a hut. These are well-built wooden houses. Now, all we have left in the museum is the front panel, the entry panel. That's what you'd see, and they worship grizzly bears. That's maybe not obvious, so if it isn't, you should write that. But you can see, look at these lovely images of the faces of grizzly bears here, right? And then the raised arms. In fact, they almost have human-like hands instead of paws. And the two ears, the exaggerated eyebrows, nose, and lips. It's fascinating. And even their claws on the bottom of their feet. It's a very, very affectionate, you could say, right, or endearing image of an animal they worshiped, which they lived with. Grizzly bears were all over that part of North America, of course, in the Pacific Northwest. And sometimes they did hunt them, but not always. In any case, this is one of the many, many examples of animals, particularly grizzly bears or other kinds of bears, being used to illustrate a guardian guardianship, if you want to say, an animal that's guarding the entrance for this family's compound, or I keep saying compound, a lodge, a wooden house, a large wooden house containing multiple generations of a family or clan. So you're welcome to come in if you mean no harm. If not, stay out, is the way you could say that the message it's sending here. But it also indicates their respect and admiration for, in general, the natural environment, but that, as we know, is true of most indigenous cultures, but definitely for grizzly bears, this particular culture. I won't say they worship grizzly bears. You could say in a way they did. They carved images of them on their totem poles, but they admired and valued the presence of grizzly bears, and didn't just hunt them and for hides and things. They lived with them. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meaning. So let's do a formal analysis. It's completely balanced. I mean, wherever you draw the line, it's a large piece of wood, which, to me, the legs balance the two ears. I mean, it's pretty obvious. And then the head is about the same width as the torso. It's roughly balanced, top to bottom and left to right. Lines are thick, bold outlines around the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. And I wouldn't say that's outline. The lips and the eyebrows are not outlines, but they're very, thick, almost a kind of simulated texture. That'd be the only simulated texture I see here. Well, perhaps the claws, on the bottom of the feet. But otherwise, there isn't much simulated texture. It's just lines and colors. And the colors are, of course, black is obviously neutral, and then you have light tan and red. So those are mostly dominant colors, are primarily warm reds and tans. The simulated texture is limited, as I already said, to the nose. I would say to the face, not really anywhere else, because these are all stylized to the result of trying to make this almost a human-like, figure in the middle, at least, with the arms and the fingers. So it's not meant to be accurate simulated texture really anywhere. And of course, on the head, now we have proportion that's distorted. The head of no grizzly bear is that wide or that big compared to the body. It couldn't survive if that was the case. So it's obviously exaggerated, the face, the head, the whole head, as are the ears, right? And the rest of the body is, too small in proportion. So there's no question this is altered or distorted proportions, the way I just mentioned. But there's no scale issue here because this is only a single object. Or is it? If you want to say these are also smaller, looking like almost baby bears, grizzly bears, somehow inside the ears of a mother grizzly bear, well, that's not really what I would say. But if you think of it that way, you could say that there's also a distorted scale between those figures of the incorporated into the body of this mother grizzly. If you think of them as smaller figures, because they're complete figures, if you look closely, then clearly the scale between the two smaller or baby figures inside the ears and the rest of the mother's figure is out of proportion. Okay, let's see. Texture modeling, I don't see any modeling here. And is it stable or dynamic? It's mostly dynamic, except you could make the case that, the head is almost more so a vertical, and these two arms, raised arms are, but most of the body has curved lines. And of course, the entire bottom section around the opening there, the knees and the ears. So it's more stable than dynamic. Okay, and the obvious rhythms, the repeated shapes of the eyes, the eyebrows, the ears, and the hands and legs. Okay, this is now Taos Pueblo, New Mexico. Taos, I'm sure some of you have been there. It's a wonderful historic indigenous city in northern New Mexico. Taos, T-A-O-S. There's a city with that name, which is where this one is. Taos Pueblo, New Mexico. And again, you could ignore the little C, but we have circa 1500. So these were adobe or mud brick houses created by indigenous culture known as the Pueblo Indians, although there are variations. And in the mountains further up, you see here, this is the mountainous part of northern New Mexico, where this culture before the Spanish arrived dominated the mountains of the southern part of the Rockies. You could just say it that way. Not just New Mexico, but up into Colorado, right? and over into Arizona. So in the southern part of the Rocky Mountains, the Pueblo Indians, I think everyone knows how to spell that, right? The Spanish word Pueblo. Well, Pueblo were the dominant culture, and they built thousands of years ago. They were doing this permanent housing for each family. And again, these were extended families, right? Remember that, multiple generations under the same roof. And it's a style of architecture the Spanish copied or imitated, you could say, after they arrived and, of course, invaded and conquered these cultures. Although the Pueblos fought back several times and kicked the Spanish out at least twice, totally out of their regions. And then the Spanish would come back years later. So there was a constant battle between those cultures for decades. But at the point where this was built, there was no Spanish invaders anywhere near this part of North America. These were, independent tribes. And they built their homes out of stucco over brick, over stone or brick, right? Or even just mud brick, which is the Spanish word adobe, which many of you means a house, a type of house built out of mud brick. These were permanent enough that I haven't been there in decades, but my memory of it is it's open. Some of these are open to the public, but still being lived in hundreds of years later. These are actually inhabited by descendants of the original Pueblo tribe that built it. I think most of these had stucco over stone, but they also built out of mud brick. And that's the kind of house the Spanish calls adobe. And they actually use those all over California. You know this. There's adobe houses built by the Spanish over 200 years ago, all up and down California coastal towns, including here in Sonoma County. So the two types of construction, this would be the more solid, or you could say stronger type of construction, by the Pueblo culture would be either stone covered with stucco or actual mud brick. And the point is, this is in front of the main plaza where they would have their religious ceremonies and events, important events like weddings and holidays, celebrations, feasts, so various kinds of public events, religious ceremonies, feasts, holidays, weddings, etc., were carried out or conducted with the whole tribe attending, or all those who could come to, out of their houses into this plaza. And it hasn't changed. I've been there recently enough to say, and I've looked at a documentary where this is pretty much the same as it was when it was built well over 500 years ago. Oh yeah, wooden beams were used for to hold the ceiling, and then the top of the roofs were covered in clay tiles. That seems to be a universal material for many cultures around the world who didn't have each other to imitate. So it's just kind of a unique thing about indigenous architecture in parts of Europe, of course, all the way back to Greek and Roman times, and then of course for thousands of years here in North America and Latin America, South America, and most of Asia. Clay tile is just a common material because it comes from the earth and it's right there and it lasts for a long time. So these roofs were covered in clay tiles and they were supported by wooden beams. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. This is a black and white photo, so I'm gonna have to tell you the houses are warm. You probably could guess that. They're a warm sand color, quite literally. And the beams would be, light brown, wooden color. The rhythm is obvious. Each house is rectangular. The doors and windows are repeated shapes. And each individual house is completely stable. There are no diagonal or curved lines visible here. And then the modeling is the shadows from the sun on each individual building. You can see that here. Is there a larger and smaller mass? I leave that up to you. I think this house, which is 5 levels, so we're going to do space in a minute, the tallest section, if it's a single family compound with multiple generations, then it would be the largest mass within this village. You see that there, 5 levels. Right, if you count this story here, which these are all occupied, these different stories. So here, most of them are 2 stories or 2 levels. Usually families, each one had their own separate section. So then some other family lived, in this second level here, stepped back from the family below them, so they, of course, lived on top of each other, not literally, but within houses that were stacked on top of each other. So this, for space, here we go, it's an important detail. Multi-story complex of houses, the tallest section of which is 5 stories. Most of it is 2 stories. And each house had about an 8-foot high ceiling, each house. I've been inside one or two of these. We're getting some, hang on,
That looks like.
getting some, here, go to mute. Apparently some people have joined us late. There we go. Hopefully that'll do that. All right, so let's wrap it up. The color I already mentioned, the modeling. Texture is the real rough texture of stucco or mud brick, but you can make it smooth. So I guess it's how you decide that, how you interpret this. To me, that looks rough, but if you want to think when they were brand new with a brand new coat of stucco, it might have been smooth, but I'm just going to say natural or real, not simulated textures of rough, real plaster over stone or brick and rough, real wood beaming. Obviously, we mentioned the rhythm. Let's see, balanced. It's unbalanced. This section is all we can talk about, what the photo shows. It's unbalanced, of course, because of the 5-story portion, which rises 2 stories above the others. I mean, there's some 3 levels, third level here. I mean, but that's not, most of it is 2 levels. So it is unbalanced toward right now. I already said that these houses were large single family residences inside with about 8-foot high ceilings. It's all real space. There's no distortion of proportion, right, or scale here. I mean, these are all just the sizes that each one needed to be for each family. Now, we are going to do this. We are going to stop the screen share just for a minute, and I am now going to pull out or pull up the file for the Miwok. There we go. Whoops. Things like to disappear. Come on. There we go. Why does it keep doing that? That's the kind of thing that drives me nuts. Hang on, because this is a must-know slide. It won't take too long. Once I get it pulled up, it should be just about a minute. Okay. All right. I'm not sure what to do. If it does that again, I'm gonna. Okay, my class slide. Has anybody had this problem with your files at home? Why is it doing that? I've seen it do that once this semester, but let's not give up, because I'll give you, let's say 2 minutes. I can't see where else this could be. That's a glitch that I have a little patience with, but give me at least another minute. Of course, I'm going to stick around anyway to, I don't know what else to do here. I've already brought this up. This is bizarre. It's like whack-a-mole, whack-a-doodle, or whatever that's called, whack-a-mole. We need to see this slide. I may have to wait to show it to you at the end, at the beginning of the next lecture. Has anybody seen this? Maybe that's it. Let's try it one more time. Okay, for some reason it didn't like the last. So, okay, here we go. The Miwok slides. Okay, we're going to see. I'll go ahead and give you the titles while we're here. They are, and only one of them is a must know. Okay, and I'll go straight to that one. But these are all taken from 2 real sites that you can, anybody here can go take a look at, and get extra credit, 10 points if you take 4 or more photos and produce a PDF, and email it to me and mention where that site is, your name and the class you're in. So it's our last must know for today. Miwok Village, Miwok. Some of you know that. That's the culture that occupied most of what Sonoma and Marin County before the arrival of Europeans, the indigenous culture of the North Bay. One of the 2, actually, but we're focusing on them for today. Miwok Village, 2 words. Novato, yep, the town in Sonoma County, just across the county line. It's easy to find. There is a sign on the freeway that directs you to this village, but you could easily Google it. It's a state park. And we are going to look at this image. And let's hope that I can do, whoops, I don't know if you can see it. Can you guys see this? I don't think I got to the screen share. Okay, so I have to do this, right? Hang on. Here we go. Now you should be able to see it. Can you guys see this?
Oh, yes. we
Good,
can see
thank
that.
you, thank you. I'm going to show you the broader view because there's 2 places you can see this kind of architecture, and it is architecture. Here we go. If there is a slide about this culture, the one that's on the syllabus, this is the slide you'll see. because it's a unique recreation. So here we go. Miwok Village is the name of a state park. It's called the Ohlone National or State, sorry, California State Park. But you could just look it up, and the phrase Miwok Village is on the sign, the entrance. It's run by the state park system, maintained, owned, and access is therefore granted if you pay for parking. It's like $8 to park in their parking lot. And these are recreations done, probably 50 or more years ago, of what a Miwok village, a small section of one village, would have looked like. Again, if you didn't write this, now you should. The Miwoks were the indigenous culture that occupied most of Marin and southern Sonoma County. You could say large parts of the North Bay, meaning Marin and Sonoma County, for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived. And they built these, some people think they look like teepees. I've heard people say that in my classes, and I wouldn't dispute that, but they're not teepees because they're not made out of animal hides. They're made out of more permanent materials, which are redwood boards that were cut from redwood trees. It's a lot of intense labor to create one of these. And this may look like it's barely the height of an adult man, but it's much taller. It's much taller. If you walk up to these, that's about how tall a 6-foot adult would be. So they were large enough to house entire families. And here's another one up close, but let's just concentrate on this one image because I think we'll just end with this slide here. So these are recreations of several 100-year-old village that was there when the first Spanish arrived. It was eventually abandoned, of course, after the colonial period, or during the colonial period, even before the gold rush. This village had ceased to be inhabited by the native culture, but it survived for several decades past the arrival of the Spanish. So that's how we know about it, is from the written descriptions of it. And there were no photos that far back. We're talking about late 1700s. So there weren't photos of it, but there were drawings. Spanish artists, missionaries, whatever, would draw, illustrations of the different indigenous cultures, the people, and their villages. So this village is one of the largest, by the way. The one that's what's now part of Novato, that is a state park, would have up to 5,000 people, at least 1,500, so somewhere in that range. And it probably varied the population from one generation to another, depending on drought conditions and harvests. They were farming people. They were pastoral. In other words, they weren't, they fished and they farmed. They did not hunt. I'll give you a brief, now we'll go back to this to do the formal analysis in just a minute, but this is the museum on the grounds. It's several miles away, also in Novato, called the Museum of the American Indian. I recommend it. It's a small museum. You can see the whole thing in an hour. So tell them I sent you, but you don't have to do that. It's like a contribution, a voluntary donation, which I think it's reasonable to give at least $10 when you go to a place like this. In any case, you can see everything from handmade dolls of various Western North American tribes, including Navajos, Eskimos, or Inuits, sorry, is the right word. Here's an actual stuffed buffalo, if you believe that. But my favorite part of it is the section with all of the figures of, look at this. Now that's a modern figure, of course, but the actual canoe is hundreds of years old, made by Miwok tribes people. And duck decoys and all kinds. Look how detailed this one is. They're fascinating. So they did hunt some fish and fowl. So they did eat meat. Yes, they weren't total vegetarians, but they were more so vegetarian than they were or farming culture than they were a hunting culture. Let's go back to the main view here. That museum is in Novato, and it's called the Museum of the American Indian. And it's run by a woman who is from a Navajo. She is Navajo. I interviewed her for my article, which is another extra credit option. In November of last year, I did an article in Random Written Magazine. It'd be easy to look up in their archives. And if you sent a link to it, you get 5 points. Hopefully you'd read it, but you're not going to be tested on what I wrote in the article, but on the notes you take here. Okay, so let's wrap up this slide. And then I'm going to stop the recording just to make sure we don't run out of storage space before I start taking questions. Okay, the rhythm is obvious. These are conical shape, living quarters, houses. They're houses. They, of course, each one has a rhythm within it of each of these redwood boards that were used, tied together at the top, right? For space, it's obviously all real space. The tallest ones were about 10 feet tall. The peak of the, the cone, the point, if you will, say the top part of this roof was about 10 feet high and large enough. I don't have the exact dimensions, but wider than they were tall. So well over 10 feet across, large enough to house an extended family, maybe a dozen or more people. And then of course, the texture is the real rough texture of the wood. There's no simulated texture. There's no modeling. It's just shadows that created by the sun. The colors would be warm when the redwood was new, and you can see that on this board. But of course, now it's faded into a silver gray color because he's been here for decades. These recreations of these Miwok houses. So this would have been originally a warm color, but it's become cool now. Of course, there's no line here. I don't really see any. I mean, maybe you could stretch it and say, well, there's a bit of visual line between each of the boards. You could say that, but I don't really see any line. There's certainly no carved or painted line. Dynamic, totally. There are no straight lines in it, except this board, which had been one. I imagine there was 3 or 4 side by side to create a door to keep out the cold and animals at night, of course, while they slept. So only the boards at the very front entrance would be stable. Everything else is dynamic, of course, the diagonal lines. And here the largest mass is the house on obviously the far right, then the one on the far left, and then the one in the middle. So this might have been for a couple that just starting out or had just 1 or 2, young children. This had been for a larger family, of course. And let's see. Balanced, yeah, each one is symmetrical left to right and unbalanced toward the bottom. And there's no alteration of proportion or scale here. Okay, I'm going to stop the share so we don't run out of, I don't run out of the sources. This has got to be posted by Friday along with Monday's lecture on YouTube. Okay, any questions that anybody has about anything we covered today or extra credit? I still, you guys have plenty of time. I wouldn't worry, but it's, going to help a lot of people who are, earning pretty good grades, but could guarantee they'll get an A in the class if they did all the extra credit. That applies to a large percentage of both my classes. And so far, the most anyone has done is, I think, 15 points or 20, and let me double check. That doesn't matter. I'm not going to read out anyone's names here. One person has 30 points. Okay, but the maximum is 60. So you've still got, even those who've done some extra credit, and you got time. The deadline for extra credit is the end of final exams week. That's in the syllabus. And so you have time. But if I were you, I'd do some extra credit before the second midterm, which is November 9th. So no new assignments until the second week of November. And you will have, by the beginning of November, detailed instructions on how the second midterm will be given. It's totally different than the first midterm or the final. It's a different format. It's an essay format. It's new because we're required to do 3 tests now. And I ran it by the department chair, and she said that's a good way to test people for their second exam. But that's not until the second week in November. So you've got some time. Just do the reading and keep up with the lectures. Okay. Anybody have any really urgent questions? Again, I'll check my email, and the 2 people that mentioned that I, had overlooked, my overwhelmed brain right now, that they had sent recently, resent and verified they had originally sent, and I just hadn't gotten them their papers by the deadline. They will get confirmation from me. I made a note to myself, even if they don't remember to ask me to do that. So you don't have to resend them. But there are a couple of people still left who I haven't yet received a paper, a first research paper from. So if you're one of those, please try to do that as soon as you can. Okay, one more time. Anybody have any urgent questions? Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off because I got another class to
I have a
Mm-hmm.
get.
question just
Sure.
real fast. So I know it says under week 12 for October 31st through November 2nd, it says that the second midterm is due. But I was curious because I'm looking on the syllabus and I'm not seeing when our next essay is due.
There isn't a second essay except the second midterm. It's a good question. Is an essay format. And yeah, the midterm is due by midnight, November 9th, and I'm going to give it in real time, but it's going to be an essay. I'll go ahead and give you a clue. okay? Because it's extra, it's so different. And I want to give you the information when you've seen the email with a PDF that gives you the actual test itself to look at as a template. But I'll go ahead and tell you what it's going to be. I haven't created that test yet. That's almost a month from now. It's going to be an essay format where you're going to be shown 4 different works of art that we've already covered up until the 1st of November. And one of those, only of those 4, you'll have a whole week to take notes on those. Well, you should already have the notes. There'll be slides that were on the syllabus. So what you'll end up with is one of those 4 will be the actual midterm. I was told this is done all the time. I mean, I've never done it, but this is now what we have to do. Something like this is what the new art department guidelines require for all art history classes. And it makes sense. I used to do this at Cal, UC Berkeley. In history, we'd have a professor say, and my daughter does in her online history classes at the JC and back in high school even, the teacher will say, okay, one of these 4 items you're going to be tested on, study for all 4 of them. And then the day of the test, you'll have on the screen 1 slide from one of those 4 that I told you would be the group that you're going to be tested, one of which you'll be tested on. And then it's an essay format, but it's too early to give you all the details. I mean, it wouldn't mean anything to you. I'll have a detailed email. You'll have the form of the test sheet itself, the grade sheet, all of that you'll be sent as PDFs a week before. And you're not going to have to go out and do original research unless you didn't take notes on one of those slides when I gave them in class. Then you would have to, but you should have the notes from each of those slides. But you should study them and have them out and have them ready with you. So when the test is given on November 9th, that's the test, not November 2nd. That's when you're going to get the 4 slides, of one of which you'll have to write an essay about. But there'll be no bibliography. Obviously there won't be a bibliography in an in-class real-time test. So you won't have that issue. No in-text citations or no bibliography. It'll be worth 100 points, and it'll be easy for those that have been taking notes all along, because you will already have the notes. And it gives you kind of a heads up. You could even start, if you want to, composing answers to all 4 so that whichever one you pick, but you'll have plenty of time. And if you are one of those people who needs and it has accommodations, of course, you have till midnight. You have way longer than, of course, most people in an in-person class only get an extra half hour. And that's what's going to happen with my in-person classes, because those are hard copies they do in class of the same exact type of exam. Do you have, I think I heard someone ask, or maybe the same person, a follow-up question? I know it isn't clear right now, but you get some idea. Since you've been asking, I thought I'd give you a heads up. This is not going to be a fact-based, dates, names, numbers, a spelling thing. It's going to be essay format, and you'll end up just writing a page and a half on each of the 2 halves, 1 half on the meaning and 1 half on the formal analysis. Very similar to what you did on your papers. In essence, the same kind of essay, but with no bibliography or footnotes. And it doesn't have to be as long as your papers, obviously, because you don't have as much time to write. But you'll have plenty. You'll have till midnight. And that'll give you 7 or 8 hours after the slides are on the screen. And
Thank you for the clarification.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I just said thank you for the clarification, just because.
Oh, I thought you said.
No, thank you. Thank you for the clarification and whatnot. Because the syllabus was a bit confusing.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's new to me too, but I think it's going to be a much better way to balance out between, because a lot of people have talked of art history. I know students of mine have told me this. Their friends would tell, don't take an art history class. It doesn't matter who the teacher is. They're all just memorization. Well, some teachers, that is all it is. At UC Berkeley, we had professors like that. That's all you did was memorize hundreds of slides, out of which dozens were given on the test, and that's it. That doesn't about what art is only. I mean, yes, it's part of the meaning of the work part. So this won't be like that. It'll just be a single image out of the 4 that you've been given a week's notice on. One of them, you write an essay like you did for your research papers. And it won't have to be as long, and it won't have a bibliography. But you will need to write a full 3 pages during the hours and hours you'll have from the time that the test starts. And then, of course, I'll sign off at the end of that class, and you can keep working if you need to up till midnight. Hope that helps. And you'll get an email describing it, all of you, of course, in both classes. Okay, are we ready to Well, I hope I'll see all of you. Well, I assume I will.
I
Most of
have
you-
one quick
Sure.
question. You mentioned that there was a paper that you had written and it was in regards to extra credit. Would you, I kind of missed where.
Oh, I see. That's called it's what it is like a couple of paragraphs at the end or near the bottom of a 2-page document called the course grading policies, and it describes each of the extra credit options. But if you still have questions after that, you can email me or ask me in class. But you need to see that, is what it sounds like. You didn't get it or you don't have it.
Or maybe I need to go back. Oh, I misunderstood. I thought it was something you had, like an article you had written or a paper you.
Oh,
had
no, I've had 2 art themed novels. I think I told people these were vetted, run through the proper channels by the administration and by the deans and by the head of the art department years ago. And those are worth 15 points if you just download them and show me that you did that, because they are directly related to the kind of art we're studying in this class. One's about growing up in Chicago in the early 60s in Obama's old neighborhood. That's where I was born and raised. Civil rights movement, the Cuban Missile Crisis. God forbid we have a similar situation with Putin now, but yeah, it's in the news, right? So that's, and also the characters are a family of artists. So that's one of the options. But that's all of this is on the, it's not a separate thing, in other words. So you could double check for your options.
Okay.
And then another one is so-called murder mystery, but really it's not, it's an architectural focus, which we are covering architecture, and that's one of the 2 novels options. Those are worth 15 points. Each article you send me is worth 5. Each museum you go to 10. All of that summarized at the bottom page and the top of the second page. It's a 2-page document. And if you don't have that, anybody out there now, then please tell me and I'll resend it. It's a PDF that's called the course grading policies, which I sent out the first week, but some people might not still have it. But I
Okay.
think that clears that up, I hope.
And that came along with the syllabus?
Yep,
Okay.
you
So
should
I-
have it if you want me to resend it. If you can't find it,
All right, I'll let you know. I'll
Yeah.
look. If not.
there we go.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. All right, I'm going to sign off because I have to get ready for another class and meet one of my
Very
readers.
good.
All right,
Thank you.
you guys, have a good week.
Bye,
Thank
you too.
Bye, thanks.